Welcome to Clinical Trialblazers, a podcast by Parexel Biotech, where we dive deep into the journeys of industry leaders shaping clinical research and biotech innovation. I am your host, Alberto Grignolo. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Sam Blackman, co-founder and former chief medical officer of Day One Biopharmaceuticals, board member of the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation, Bonum Therapeutics and CureSearch for children's cancer, and the new entrepreneur in residence at Google Ventures. Sam is an avid storyteller, known for his pioneering work in pediatric oncology and improving outcomes for cancer patients. Today, we will discuss his remarkable career journey, his vision for founding Day One Biopharmaceuticals, the challenges and opportunities in pediatric oncology drug development, and his insights on the future of clinical research. Dr. Sam Blackman, thank you so much for being here. I believe you're allowing me to call you Sam. So Sam, welcome.
Thank you, Alberto. I not just allowing, I insist on it. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. You have worked across big pharma, biotech startups, and most recently as the founder of Day One. Can you share a story from your past that helped shape your passion for this field?
A couple of anecdotes that I can share. I was the firstborn son of a pediatrician from New Jersey. So to some extent, I wasn't so much born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I was born with a stethoscope around my neck. My father told me as I was growing up constantly, he'd say, Sammy, because he called me Sammy. He goes, Sammy. He goes, you can do whatever you want to do in this life after you graduate medical school. And so I was really put on a path very early to consider a career in medicine, which, and it's a whole long story otherwise, but eventually I came around to, I took a rather circuitous route to it. But when I did finally decide to go into medicine, I originally thought I was going to be an anesthesiologist, but after a number of years, I realized that I truly loved taking care of children, and within that, children with severe and life-threatening diseases. The farther that I went into my pediatric training, the more it was clear to me that I was at my very best as a physician. I was at my very best as a human being when I was involved in the care of children whose lives were at risk from a certain disease. That's what led me to pediatric oncology and ultimately my training in pediatric brain tumors.
Did you find that you're particularly good with children, particularly comfortable with children? You make them feel comfortable with you? Was that an early epiphany you might have had?
I think so. I mean, I tell people that, I'm beloved by small dogs and small children. That they both seem to respond to me. I was always the type of person who, I would be the person who sat down on the floor and talked to the child while the parents were standing around, or maybe I'd just sit and play with the kid while the parents were standing around and talk to the parents. But it was very, very easy for me to do that because to some extent, as I progressed through my career in science, I've always tried to maintain this childlike sense of wonder about the world, particularly the world within science. That's what gives me joy, right? Approaching the world every day, eyes wide open to new things. And so I think I relate to some extent to children well. I think my wife would probably say that I'm basically act like a big child most of the time. So it makes sense that I would do well with children. But, the other piece of it is, of course, parents. Children are never your patients in isolation. They come with parents and siblings and grandparents and aunts and uncles. And for that, being a teacher, which was another component of my career journey while I was in graduate school, I think is part of what made me ultimately an effective pediatric oncologist.
So in due course, you were drawn to drug development in oncology in particular, and come to think of it, you were drawn to pediatric oncology in particular. What inspired you to do that?
Yeah, so the decision to go into drug development was really shaped by a couple of things. One was something intensely personal, which was at the time I had finished my academic training, I also had become a father. And knowing how much I cared about taking care of patients and giving them 150%, and knowing how much I was going to care about taking care of my own child and wanting to give her 150%, I realized that that was 300%. And I was only 100% of a person. And it forced a choice, which was how would I have a career in science and medicine that would also allow me to be the type of parent that I wanted to be. And it was for that reason that when a headhunter called and began asking me about my interest in jobs in drug development, I decided to peek behind that curtain and see what was there. And it was really the very first job that I interviewed for, which was at Bristol Myers Squibb, that I ended up meeting someone who I had never met, but whose work I had heard of, someone named David Berman, who's now at Immunocore, but he had been at BMS. And I knew about David Berman because he had worked in Al Gilman's lab back in the 90s, and Gilman had won the Nobel Prize for G proteins. And I had heard about his work from Gilman himself when he was giving a plenary talk. And so, much to my surprise, when I was interviewing at BMS and I sat down with David Berman, I was immediately struck by the question, you had everything that an academic could have hoped for. Why are you here at Bristol Myers Squibb? And he said simply, I can do bigger and better things here. And that, from somebody who I really looked up to scientifically, opened my eyes to an alternative path. And that's one thing that got me into drug development. The pediatric side happened to be a matter of timing, because I joined, it turned out to be Merck in 2008. And that was right after the European Medicines Association started requiring companies to develop pediatric investigation plans. And so here I was, new drug developer, but coming from a background in pediatric oncology. And the folks at Merck were like, you do this stuff, like you should do this. And so very early on in my career in drug development, I began to understand how I could use this huge machine to begin to think about ways of advancing new therapeutics for the patients that I cared the most about. And so my career really started 17 years ago with both components in place, learning how to be a drug developer and learning how to develop drugs for children.
Was there a sense in your thinking at the time that as an active pediatrician, clinician, you could help maybe tens of thousands of patients in your career, but by developing a new drug, you might actually be able to help millions in your career? Was there any sense of that in your mind at the time?
I think that's what certainly is the rationalization that I made to myself when I decided to walk away from patient care, which was something that had always been deeply, deeply satisfying to me. I knew that I'd be able to help children one at a time, and maybe over the course of my career, right, thousands of patients. But over the course of a 30 or 40 year career, the dream, of course, I think for anybody who goes into drug development is to have an impact that's orders of magnitude greater. And that was really what I told myself. So you can imagine how pleased I am to have had that actually come to pass, over the course of the last 17 years of my life. I like to believe that the work that I've done has in fact had a disproportionate impact relative to what I could have done as a clinician seeing 8 or 10 patients a day.
Yeah. And we'll certainly get to that in this conversation. You mentioned David Berman as being particularly inspiring. That's what I heard you say. Were there other, individuals that inspired you, and what lessons did you gather from these mentors that, you still cherish to this day, perhaps?
Oh boy. I mean, I think, look, anybody who's been in this field and has had either a sustained career or has had a career where they've been fortunate enough to grow in their role, you don't get down the road a ways unless you have outstanding mentors. I think one of my favorite things about working in science and working in medicine and working in drug development is the fact that, not only are we a community of people who are self-directed learners, you have to be, but we're also a community of teachers, right? The word doctor comes from the Latin docere, to teach, right? It's who we are. It's in our DNA. I think it's beyond that. It is our fundamental obligation to each other, right? The Hippocratic Oath, basically says you shall treat the son, right, of your colleagues as if, right, they're your own son. This is thousands of years. As antiquated as that is, I think that there's still something relevant there. We have an obligation to teach and mentor. So, yeah, I've had remarkable people. Like I'll my very first manager at Merck, actually the person who hired me was Jamie Friedman, who went on to have a career at AstraZeneca and Roche. Interestingly, when I showed up for work that very first day at Merck, he had already moved on to a new role. So I was immediately introduced to the fact that things are very dynamic in industry. But the manager who I ended up working with at Merck, Don Bergstrom, who is now the president and head of research and development at Relay Therapeutics, really was both inspiring and foundational in how I began to think about translational research, trying to get to proof of concept early, designing elegant and creative experiments to show that a drug is working as early as possible. That has shaped me through the course of my career. And of course, that relationship has been sustained. I just had dinner with Don last week in Boston, and we continue to talk about how to solve problems effectively and creatively through our roles today. So Don is one of many people along the way who have inspired me, and more recently, of course, the CEOs and CFOs and people on the corporate side that I've worked with have inspired me in disciplines beyond science and medicine, and how to be a good leader and how to think about capitalizing companies and financing the work that we all consider to be so important.
Is there a cherished lesson from one of your mentors that stands out in your mind as being maybe life-changing for you, a lesson that has stayed with you for decades?
When you ask me that question, what immediately pops to mind has actually nothing to do with any one mentor, but your question elicits for me a memory from even before I started in medical school. I was in college, or maybe right after college, and I was doing volunteer work in the emergency room at the University of Chicago. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s, as I was thinking about going into medicine. Back then, the University of Chicago was a level 1 trauma center. And so on the south side of Chicago, during the summers, we'd have very busy days. We'd get a call from Chicago Fire Department ambulances. There'd be some trauma patient who was on their way in. And it didn't take me very long to notice that these emergencies would elicit just a flurry of activity, some of which seems incredibly discoordinated. You have a patient and there'd be 20 or 25 people in the room, and everybody's trying to get access to do their part of the job. And there'd just be this seeming chaos, all centered around this desire to save this person's life. And what I would notice is in a lot of the circumstances where things went well, there would be typically one person, and it was either a senior resident or a fellow or an attending, and they'd be standing in the corner or maybe standing at the head, but they'd be not a frenzy of activity. They'd be taking everything in and integrating everything that they're seeing, and thoughtfully and quietly and most importantly, calmly directing what's going on. It was the first time that I saw the importance of maintaining a level head in the face of chaos. What William Osler, when he wrote his essay Equanimitas, really meant, right, is the world is chaotic around you, particularly, well, certainly in medicine sometimes beyond that. But it's the ability to be equanimitable, to maintain your composure and clarity of thought in the face of a lot of things changing all at once is really what's necessary to succeed in your mission as a physician. And I would argue, certainly given everything that's going on in the world today, in what we do in our industry. That vision of that doctor standing there, calm in the storm and making sure that everybody's working towards a unified purpose, has been the inspiration for me in so many areas of my life over the past 10, 15 years.
That's remarkable. You have now become a mentor. And so I want to ask you, how do you approach mentorship for the next generation of clinical trial innovators or physicians or pediatricians in whatever constituency you like to focus on these days?
I will tell you, Alberto, I wish I had more opportunities to formally mentor people. I will tell you, at least, in terms of doing what I can, if there's an opportunity, I always take it. My email is always open. LinkedIn is always open. I will routinely, and I'm very lucky and flattered, get emails from people in residency or people in fellowship or people early in their career or at a transition point And I always take the opportunity both to learn about people, because I think that's how you discover excellent talent, right? Folks who aren't afraid to reach out to somebody and say, hey, can I talk? The people who are self-aware enough to reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking about making changes. I'm trying to change direction. Can you give me advice? That self-awareness is not a universal feature in people. So I recognize that in people, and then I want to get to meet and know those people and file them away in my brain. And then if there are opportunities for me to go out and proactively talk to people in training, I do that. And then sometimes I'll find something that's completely out of the blue, but just scratches an itch for me to be a teacher. I talked to 2 classes of 7th graders at a middle school in North Carolina through a remarkable program called Skype a Scientist, and talked to them about what makes cancer cells, and explain some of the basic aspects of this field to very curious 7th graders, in the hope that you can inspire one person, right? Get one kid to say, wow, that was really cool. I want to think about a career in science. Planting these seeds now, right? Even if you don't necessarily stick around to see whether or not it grows or sprouts into a tree, but planting the seeds, I think, is our obligation in general as people in this field.
And a few decades ago, you were the kid that were inspired to go into medicine, in pediatrics in particular, Absolutely. And in oncology drug development. Let me turn to the company you founded, the company you named Day One. Is there a story behind that name and how it guided the mission of the company?
Of course, there's a story. So when we got our seed funding, when Julie Grant and I pitched Canaan for seed funding for this vision of a company, and Kane had said, yes, we knew we had a target date for filing the incorporation papers. And Julie said, well, we got to come up with a name. And so I tried to come up with every iteration of the word kinder farm, kinder bio. They were all terrible. So I was sitting in my dining room at home, sort of staring at the ceiling and trying to come up with a name. And I took a moment to ask myself, why am I doing this? Like, I'm about to jump off a cliff, not take a regular job, and go all in on an idea. We had a couple of $1 million as a convertible note. Like, why am I doing this? And as I was, contemplating that question and what it was that ultimately I wanted to have happen if we were successful, is it took me back to my very first week in fellowship at Dana-Farber. And I showed up to start my training in pediatric oncology. And one of the first things that they did during that week of orientation is they taught us how to do something called a Day One talk. And when they said, we're going to teach you how to do a Day One talk, I'm like, well, what's a Day One talk? And they said, that's the discussion that you are going to have over and over again with the families of children recently diagnosed with cancer, newly diagnosed with cancer, where you're going to explain to them the disease now that you have a secure diagnosis, and you're going to explain the treatment plan. You're going to explain the alternatives and the risks and benefits, and you're going to begin to lay out for them a vision of the path that you are going to walk down with them as you take their child through treatment. And the purpose of the Day One talk is to get the parents to trust you as their oncologist, to get them, for you to get to know them and understand them and meet them where they are, and to begin to partner together with the common purpose of trying to make their child well. And it struck me that was the perfect name, because the Day One talk is almost like a signal to the pediatric oncology community that we're there for them. Okay. And I wanted to build a company where we would provide new medicines at future Day One talks, but most importantly, where we would build trust with the people who are going to be taking our medicines or enrolling on our clinical trials, in the same way that we were taught to build trust with families when we were talking to them about how we're going to treat their children in the hospital. That was where the name came from. And I can tell you, it has really resonated with people. I'm not, not a professionally trained in branding or marketing, but I think that the name really does serve as a beacon. It lets people know what our core values are and who we are as a team.
I imagine that Day One for a family whose child has just been diagnosed with cancer is an extremely difficult day.
Yes.
So the doctor's role in part is to make that day a little bit better
and provide hope, right? The so much of what is required of the parents of children with cancer and on the patients themselves, right, to get through the worst of it, because treatment is long and arduous, is the hope that what you're doing is going to yield a remission or a long-term remission or cure or long-term survival. And not false hope, right? Real hope. Hope is our greatest strength. It lets us get through remarkable amounts of adversity. And so, we wanted to tell people that, we're here not just to give, pills, but to give hope. Even when we don't have the drug across the goal line, we're working towards, trying to provide hope for future treatments.
I'd like to ask you what you think, in your experience, is the role of trust and hope by the family in the doctor.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely essential. And it's not just a one-way relationship, Alberto. It's a reciprocal relationship. I've seen, all forms of relationships with families, and nothing is worse than when there's distrust, or people are working at cross purposes. That's where mistakes can happen. That's where things don't get said out loud. That's where false assumptions are made. Hope and trust, both ways, right? Between, hope, the trust that the treating team has in the family, because you're not admitting patients 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the entire course of treatment. You're sending them home, and you're going to hope and trust that the family is going to do all the things that you ask them to do that are needed to make their child well. And then reciprocally, the family has to hope and trust that the team that they have is not just acting in the best interests of their child. Obviously, that's table stakes. And not just applying the best science, that's also base case. But that we're hearing them. We're making recommendations and implementing a plan, not generically, right, but taking into account their needs as people and as a family. So absolutely essential. And I think that's also true for so much of what we do in drug development, right? Not just between companies and patients, but within companies and the people who work there. That trust, right, of your teammates, of your leadership, that trust between companies that run trials and the patients who enroll on them, absolutely foundational. It's something that I do fear for, right? The suspicion in the world today is at an all-time high. We as an industry have to do everything that we can to restore and maintain trust with the patients who not only are the beneficiaries, but we need them to run our trials.
Given the trust is so essential and foundational, I'm just quoting you, do you think medical schools spend enough time and effort training medical students, future doctors, to build trust with the patients and their families? Is it adequate? Is it sufficient? Should more be done?
It's a great question. And I'm going to answer it by telling you in all complete honesty, because I think it would be wrong for me to pretend otherwise. I actually don't know. It's been a long time since I've been in medical school, but I can tell you this. There are a lot of things that they teach you in medical school, and in the 25 or however many years it's been since I was in medical school, the amount of knowledge that needs to be taught has exploded. I mean, medicine was easier to learn in 1993 when I started than it is today. There's so much more that we know. I can't imagine that with all of the advances in science, that there's more room in the curriculum in medicine to teach the soft skills, and not just the soft skills about building trust and building relationships with people, but teaching about leadership, teaching about working in, cross-functional teams, which is really what a treating team is. Teaching about how to adapt and manage through change. All of the stuff that I think biotech executives, particularly physicians who go on to biotech to be biotech executives, skills that they need to have. We don't learn those in medical school. We tend to learn them oftentimes through the school of hard knocks and by making mistakes afterwards. But I think that there are universal skills that apply. It would be nice if we had a way somewhere along the continuum of medical education to teach some of these things. I think we hope that people who get selected to go to medical school have some of those, but I don't know that they're always innate or fully developed.
That's right.
In people. I think coaching and mentoring and all of those things that we get afterwards develop them within us. But the sooner we do that for physicians to be or for junior physicians, I think the better.
I've certainly come to believe that the technical skills side of things in any field must be accompanied by the soft skills and the ability to interact constructively with people in an empathetic way. But that could be another whole long and important conversation.
Absolutely.
But let's get back to drug development. Okay. You've been involved in the development of small molecules, antibody drug conjugates, CAR T therapies, immuno-oncology. What do you think is the riskiest decision you've ever made in drug development? And what did you learn from it?
Well, let me talk about the riskiest thing that I was involved in. How about that?
You mean not your decision, but it was risky anyway?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't know how many times I've been at a point until maybe a little more recently where I feel like I've been the single point of decision making on something where there's a lot of risk. Usually, and I think this, decisions are not made in a vacuum. And if they are, then that should terrify, whoever's managing that company. But decision making, I think for the most part, over the course of my career has been shared. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about some of the scarier things that I've worked on.
Sure.
So I was at Juno starting in 2012. And it was relatively early days for CAR T cells. I had heard about CAR T cells when I was at GlaxoSmithKline. In fact, back then, the business development team at GSK, I was doing work with them, and they came to us with the IP from Penn saying, should we be interested in this? And I remember in 2011 or something like that, I remember saying, oh my God, that's ridiculous. There's no way you're ever going to be able to turn that into a product. Like, that is a pure academic exercise. And, much to my surprise, of course, Novartis saw it completely differently and jumped all over it, which is why Kymriah was the first to market. In 2014, I had joined Juno, and we were in a bit of a foot race with Novartis to get the first CD19 CAR T cells out there. And Juno had licensed in technology from Fred Hutch and from Sloan Kettering and from Seattle Children's. Our approach, as opposed to what Novartis was doing, which was focusing on pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia, was to go into adult lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a very different disease and a very different group of patients. And I can tell you, looking back now 10 plus years, what we knew at the time in terms of the safety of CD19 directed CAR T cells was this much compared to what we know today. Some of the early toxicities on that first Juno CAR T cell program, which was using the technology licensed out of Sloan Kettering with a CD28 co-stim, those T cells were incredibly potent. The cytokine release syndrome that we saw with that, but more importantly, the neurotoxicity, which is now, it's got its own acronym to describe it, and is absolutely terrifying. And I was the clinical lead for that program. I was the medical monitor when we began to have a handful of cases of patients with profound and fatal cerebral edema leading to brainstem herniation. And I can tell you, it was absolutely terrifying. Some of the hardest things that I went through when I was a medical monitor for him that I ever went through, knowing that you have a product and patients are getting, fatally sick and dying, and nobody knows what to do, what's causing it. And I remember one of the investigators telling me, how hopeless he felt standing by the bedside, knowing that there was some reaction that no matter what he did, he couldn't control, and that these young adults were dying right in front of him. It was about the hardest thing I think that I ever went through as a clinical drug developer. And fortunately, knock on wood, the only time that I went through something like that.
Was it a resolution?
There was a resolution. It was, and this is where I think it's important that we talk about these things out loud and we share these stories. At the time, Juno recognized these toxicities, talked to the FDA early, which was great. To some extent, put ourselves on clinical hold. And then, very quickly worked with the agency to come up with a plan to start dosing again. But, in retrospect, we still didn't have, even though we had a plan for monitoring and being more aggressive about managing the toxicity, there was a lot that we didn't know still. And so the program went ahead. After what was a very painful 3 months, sort of going through this, stepped away from the program because I was no longer confident that this going forward was necessarily the right thing to do here. Right. So I stepped away. The program continued, and unfortunately, later on that year, 2 more patients died, and then the program was put on hold and ultimately terminated. We learned a lot through that.
Was there an overarching lesson from it, an overarching learning, big picture? I
think, much like the T. Gennaro, I say disaster, I think is what the word that most people use. Yes, we did learn lessons, and we did become a lot more cautious. I think we developed a very healthy respect for the potential toxicities of this class of therapies, and really began to think about making sure that we understood not only a lot more about how these products are constructed, but the clinical context that we take them into.
Clinical trial journeys do come with setbacks, but also come with victories. Yes. And those are wonderful moments. Can you share with me a particularly meaningful success that you experienced in your career?
I mean, it would be hard for me to not talk about what happened with tovorafenib. So tovorafenib is an oral pan-RAF inhibitor that was originally made by Takeda. And Takeda had made this drug in the early 2010s, really as a next generation for the type 1 RAF inhibitors like dabrafenib or encorafenib or vemurafenib, which are fabulous drugs. And we've made a lot of BRAF V600 mutant patients better with those drugs, particularly in combination with MEK inhibitors. But there's a whole host of other BRAF alterations that aren't able to be addressed with those first generation BRAF V600 drugs. And so Takeda and others made next generation drugs, of which tovorafenib was one of those classes. The problem is that finding out who the right patients are for those types of drugs was harder to do. And it took a number of years, and they recognized that, well, here are these other BRAF mutations, but there's 20 of them, and we don't know which respond and which don't respond. And for patients who progress on a vemurafenib or a dabrafenib or an encorafenib, they don't always necessarily respond to a next generation pan-RAF inhibitor. So Takeda got a little bit bogged down. And then through a remarkable set of academic investigations, there was a group that had said, these BRAF wild type fusions, which are very common in pediatric low-grade glioma, but present in other diseases, seem to respond beautifully to pan-RAF inhibitors. And Day One came along at a time when Takeda said, well, that's great, but that's not a commercial opportunity that we're interested in pursuing. And Day One came along at a time when we had a drug, we knew the right patient population, but nobody was willing to pay to put those two things together. And we took that chance based on some early data and said, all right, this is what we'll do as our first program. And I can tell you, it's one thing to have promising phase 1 data and high hope for phase 2. But if I had $1, Alberto, for every program that looked great in phase 1 and fell apart or had regression to the mean in phase 2, I'd have a lot of dollars. Mm-hmm. So when we looked at, we had a public, announcement of an interim analysis from our phase 2 program. And I remember seeing the initial data, the medical monitor for the program. I was on a plane, sent me the initial cut of the data and the initial waterfall plot. And when I saw it, I was so profoundly moved by that, by knowing that the science held up and that we were right. We were right about the ability of the drug to get across the blood-brain barrier. We were right about identifying the patient population. We were right about the chances that we took on accruing patients who had been previously exposed to MAP kinase inhibitors. And so we had accelerated timelines because we took a broader population, but we were right that those patients weren't going to be insensitive to the drug. And then to have that laid out in a waterfall plot that you would dream about, right? Which is one where there's like a little bit of up and a lot of down.
Right.
It was just an extraordinary feeling as a physician, as a scientist, as a drug developer. It's everything. It's a completely magical feeling that you have not just been proven right. We fight with cancer, right? We fight with pathology. That you won one for the good guys, right? That you won one. You actually have a victory against a disease. That is, I think, for anybody who works in medicine, that's why we work so hard. Those are the moments that we seek.
And you received the news in an airplane. You were at 30,000 feet when you had this moment of being deeply moved.
I can't tell you how many times I've been crying on airplanes because of good news. Like when we got approved, I got a call at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning, and Jeremy Bender, our CEO, and Davey Kyoden, our chief development officer, were in the office in San Francisco. And so they got the approval letter. I didn't even know it was coming that day. I was at home in my home office on a call with my team. And when they called me, I was completely at a loss for words. I mean, it still elicits a very strong emotional reaction in me. So I packed up, jumped on a plane to get to Seattle, jumped on a plane to get to San Francisco, and I'm still processing this and having this, and I'm sitting like in an exit row, like answering emails and tears streaming down my face, like, because everybody's texting me, and the people probably sitting next to me were thinking like something was horribly wrong or that something very bad was going to happen. I'm like, no, this is wonderful. Yes, I've been the recipient of a lot of good news on airplanes.
That sounds great. Yeah. Fantastic. In your experience, there must be some barriers to running clinical trials for pediatric cancers. Yes. What are the biggest barriers in that field, in that space?
So the big barriers on the operation side, really are the fact that, and this is a good thing, there just aren't as many children with advanced cancer. This is good, right? I do not want to have as many pediatric cancer patients as the world has relapsed colorectal cancer patients. So it's great, but it does mean that it is harder to go as quickly as we want to go in terms of timelines without the close coordination of that always academic medical centers where pediatric oncology patients are seen. One of the things at day one that we really had to focus on was building out very early the infrastructure for the efficient execution of clinical trials as a sponsor. Academic pediatric medical centers do a lot of clinical trials. They do a lot, but a lot of them, as you know, are academic clinical trials. Mm-hmm. They're investigator-initiated. 100%. Yeah. So trying to prioritize, because we're on the clock, right? Our investors don't have 10 years to wait for us to get through an investigator-initiated trial. They're expecting on-time, high-quality trials that yield regulatory quality data that will allow us to march forward towards approval. Unfortunately, many children's hospitals aren't funded the same way as adult hospitals. They don't have the same volume, which means their clinical trial offices and data management people and clinical research assistants are also typically underpaid and understaffed. So recognizing this, we had to invest a lot to be able to do this. But I see this as fundamental infrastructure building, an investment, not just for us, but for anybody else who wants to develop new medicines for children with cancer. Having this much expanded network of hospitals that know how to run industry-sponsored late-stage registrationally directed trials is something that we had to build. And I'm thrilled that we did it, because I hope that it's an enduring legacy for the field going forward. Day One now has sites opening up in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, in Asia Pacific, in South America. So I'm just delighted that we made this investment. I do believe that's what it takes to bring the whole field forward to parity with where the adults are.
So is it possible then, in your experience, to move faster without compromising safety or efficacy?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that we have now seen, and it's not just with tovorafenib, right? Loxo did this with larotrectinib, right? They went incredibly quickly and developed larotrectinib for both adult and pediatric patients in parallel. I absolutely believe that with thoughtful clinical development, working closely with sites, efficiently designed clinical trials, and working with the regulators to make sure that we're understanding the unmet need in pediatric patients and making sure that our regulatory requirements through approval, right, to speed access to patients are rationally sized. It doesn't mean less quality, doesn't mean going fast and sacrificing quality or certainty, just means staging things appropriately. But with all of those components there, I don't see why we can't move at the speed of biotech when it comes to making new medicines for children. And I don't think that I'm alone in this. There are advocates within regulatory agencies and certainly plenty of people within industry, and not just in oncology and gene therapy and other rare diseases, who've been pioneers in this space and have helped move the entire field forward over the past 20 years.
Sam, you are a successful scientist, a successful drug developer, a successful entrepreneur. Not only that, but you're also a great and successful storyteller, an award-winning storyteller. You performed at the Moth, the live storytelling competition. You won awards for the work. So let me ask you about storytelling. Has your ability to be such a good storyteller influenced your ability to communicate science, inspire teams, drive innovation, and whatever else?
Well, I certainly hope so. I like to think so. There may be people out in the world who tell me I could be, drinking my own Kool-Aid, but I like to think so. Look, so much of, I think, what it takes to lead diverse and very intelligent group of people, what it takes to get mind share from busy academic physicians or physician scientists who have a ton of other competing priorities, what it takes to get the attention of investors who oftentimes have many other things competing, not just for their dollars, but also for their share of mind, is effective storytelling. It's not, and by that I mean not pedantic, how am I going to clearly explain this science to you? I think there are a lot of people who are very good at explaining science. It's about also setting a vision and getting people to buy into that vision and feel invested in that vision so that they want to see where it goes with you. When I get on the stage to tell a story, what I am trying to do from the very moment that I step up to the microphone is capture people and have them feel invested in the character in the story or characters in the story, so that midway through, and this has always been my favorite part of competitive storytelling, midway through, you have them bought into what's going to happen. They feel what's at stake. And there are these moments that I've been very lucky to be on stage, these moments where I can pause, and no matter how big the room is, how big the audience is, to pause and to hear nothing, because people are waiting for what the next word is going to be. those moments are pretty magical in of themselves. It means you've gotten you've captivated them, and they're with you. They want to know what comes next. And that technique that I've been lucky to develop over a number of years of doing this is very powerful, I think, as opposed to taking you on a flight of fancy or fantasy. It's getting you emotionally and mentally captivated by what it is that you're hearing, so that you want to see how the story unfolds. And if you're talking to investors, it means, yeah, I want to write a check because I want to see how the science unfolds. So it is a very important component of what I do. If I was to provide advice to people going into this field, or particularly entrepreneurs or executives in biotech, especially at times when competition for dollars is very, very high, and there's a wealth of new things for people to invest in every day, it's not just how good can your science be, but how effectively can you communicate it and make it into something that is captivating to people. They want to know how the story is going to unfold.
That sounds very powerful. And I suppose you applied it at day one in the other companies to motivate the staff writ large to care about what they were doing, what you all were doing together, and to want to know, how is this going to end?
Without a doubt. And I think that this is another opportunity for people to, in leadership positions, in addition to trying to tell compelling stories, the other thing that was really of help for me at day one is, the fact that I did take care of patients for a number of years, and by describing what I saw, what I felt, what it meant to me, to try to take people who were regulatory people or finance people or clinops people or, translational scientists, and through words, carry them with me into a room where I'm sitting with a family and I'm having a day one talk. By telling them those stories and getting them to feel what I felt so many years ago, right? That is a profoundly motivating tool when you're trying to lead a team into action or to work really, really, really hard. When you make it real for people, when through words or through having patients show up, it turbocharges people's motivation to do more, to do better, to go as hard and fast as they can towards getting, to the goal line.
You mentioned investors and having had to convince them, and you did that with storytelling. So let me ask you at a higher level, what would you say to biotech entrepreneurs that are trying to raise capital for projects that are probably high risk, could be high reward, it could be failures in the end? Always learnings, but maybe not failures, just learnings. We always learn even from failures. But what advice would you give to people looking for money these days, particularly?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and boy, oh boy, look, the biotech financing environment went from depressing to scary to terrifying very, very quickly.
Yeah.
But that can't be the end of what we do, right? There's too much good science right now for us to throw up our hands in frustration and say, well, forget it, we're done. It is absolutely essential, I think, for people now when they're out trying to raise capital to not just be effective in telling the story of their science. And I think it's, again, not sufficient to also talk about the potential clinical benefit. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. At the end of the day, I think what investors are looking for is a path to real value, and that's value for patients and value to those investors. I think many seasoned biotech executives, they learn this and then they do it over again. But for newer people, it's you have to be able to tell them not just, wow, this is really super cool and we're going to turn this into a medicine, but when are you going to turn it into a medicine, and how many people is that medicine going to impact? And at the time you get that done, will that be really a source of value for patients compared to other things? Will it be valued by payers so that we'll be able to generate an adequate return on the investment that we're making now? Because it's not just we're putting money in now, it means we're also not putting money into other things, and there are plenty of other interesting opportunities out there. So it's connecting the science, the patients, and the investment thesis all together in a coherent story. So you have to actually connect and represent the entire story arc, not just how do I get to a molecular development candidate or how do I get to proof of concept, but it's how do I get to approval? How do I get access to the marketplace? How do I ensure that this is not a commercial fantasy, but rather a commercial success? And what have I accounted for that could get in the way of that? Having that complete story is really, I think, what sets a mature entrepreneur apart from somebody who is just starting out.
Which brings me to my very last question, and that is, you stepped away from day one some time ago. You took some time off, and you recently announced that you're joining Google Ventures.
That's correct.
What's that about?
So GV, Google Ventures, is now known solely as GV, is a venture capital firm. It's focused on both technology and biotechnology investments. They also do work sort of in that crossover space, technologies that are important for patients and providers and payers. But it's a unique fund where they have a single limited partner, which is Alphabet, the parent company of Google. Mm-hmm. And the goal there is to invest in technologies, invest in companies that are going to have outsized impact and benefit to people. And on the life sciences side, it's really to invest in things that are going to have an important impact in human health. The team is really a remarkable group of individuals on the investing team, and certainly the rest of the folks on the team, the entire operations team that I've met to date have been incredible. And my remit is to take my clinical development and oncology expertise and add that to the traumatic expertise that we have inside of the team to evaluate existing portfolio companies for investment opportunities. But as an entrepreneur in residence, it's also to try to find things, science, either things that are coming in from externally or things that I might know about, or working with academic investigators along the way, but to find science that I think could be reduced to practice, turned into a company that is worth funding, that is going to ultimately yield something, therapeutically, that is going to have a profound impact on human health going forward. We've made so many advances over the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the response rates for most of our targeted therapies, they're 30%, 40%, 50%. That means there's another 50% of people or 60% of people who aren't responding. There is always more work to do, and always ways to harness the incredible research that is coming out of academia and out of industry to make new medicines and make new ways of treating people. And so for me, this has been just a remarkable opportunity to come in and view science a lot more broadly. I've been very focused on one thing for 6 years. Now I can think more broadly. And then also ask myself, at the right time, what is it that I want to throw myself heart and soul into? Not necessarily again as CMO, but maybe as CEO, and to test now all of my skills to try to lead a company forward. So it's a real gift that I've been given by the team at GV, and one that I really look forward to exploring over the next number of years. Your story is continuing and will remain to be told. I hope so, for many decades. I feel like I'm still a youngish kind of guy. I hope that the story has at least another dozen or so chapters. Fantastic. Very exciting indeed. Well, that is it for this episode of Clinical Trialblazers. Dr. Sam Blackman, thank you for sharing your insights and experiences with us. A couple of things stand out to me among the many that I could list, but certainly building trust with patients and the families of patients who have been diagnosed with pediatric cancer stands out. The importance of being the adult in the room, the equanimity that you mentioned, the ability to stand back and keep everybody calm, and that people look for leaders to do that, for leaders to remain calm under pressure.
if you will. And then the power of storytelling that you have told us so very well today, and how powerful that is. And some of us know that instinctively, but you really played it out and explained how very powerful it can be for many, many constituencies. So I want to really thank you for your participation today. And to the audience, I'd like to say stay tuned for more episodes of Clinical Trialblazers, where we will continue to explore human stories behind the ideas and innovations that are shaping biopharma and biotech. And please do take a moment to rate and review this podcast wherever you listen. Clinical Trialblazers is created by Parexel Biotech and hosted by me, Alberto Grignolo. Special thanks to our production partner, Wonder Media Network, and thank you for listening and for tuning in. Until next time, stay curious and let's keep pushing the boundaries of clinical research. Bye for now.